So, Lynn and Marilyn, which is your favorite pattern? Not the one you find the best to apply, because that would depend on the context, but the one you most emotionally are connected to.
That's a very good question. It's a hard one to answer, but usually my answer to that question is to say the pattern that changed me the most is the Fear Less pattern. That's the one that we used to name the first book. That pattern basically says instead of running away from resistors, you want to learn as much as you can by listening to what they have to say. It's a difficult pattern to use. I still struggle with applying it. And when I do, I'm always gratified to see that it definitely works. I do learn, and it is convincing to someone who's a resistor when someone really listens to them.
As Linda was talking, I was trying to think of my favorite one, and that's really hard. But I tend to like the hometown story pattern because I've seen the problem many times of a leader of change just rattling off statistics and facts and PowerPoint slides, which have their place. But the power of a story, putting all those facts together into a story, helps people not only understand it better, but relate to it better and be able to repeat it better. So it's a great technique for sharing information if you're a leader of change.
Why is the baby step pattern the favorite pattern of all people I talk to, was one of the questions.
Baby steps is a new pattern in a way because it doesn't appear in the original book under that name. We had a pattern called step by step. And the idea is that if you're going to introduce a new idea into an organization or into your family or into your own life, you want to take small steps as you reach your goal. Now, the problem with step by step, we found, is that it sort of conveys the sense that the progress that you're going to make with these steps is linear. That if you simply just take one step after another, then you're going to make steady progress toward your goal. And what we've learned is that systems that are as complicated as organizations have a special title. They're called complex adaptive systems. And they don't move in a linear direction. Anytime you change any little piece of a complex system, it can go in any direction, including backward. And so the idea that you're going to make linear, straight line progress, no matter how small the steps are, is just not true. So the name that we came up with as a substitute is baby steps. Babies learn by taking baby steps, falling down, getting up, taking more baby steps, and they certainly don't make linear progress. They certainly don't make consistent progress. They get discouraged sometimes, babies cry. And if they weren't good at taking baby steps, well, they would never learn how to walk. And that's the approach that we think people should have in the backs of their minds. And I think once they hear that, so once we introduce it as a new pattern name and explain the difference, then people get it, which I'm not sure they did with step by step. And so then they began to say, well, of course, that seems so obvious. Baby steps, that's how we want to make progress to our goal. So then everyone wants to include that in their plan for patterns for introducing change. Did you want to add anything to that?
No, that was good.
All right.
What shall I do when the pattern does not work? Try another pattern?
So every pattern has positive consequences. That means the wonderful things that will happen as a result of using the pattern. And every pattern also has negative consequences. So those are things to look out for, So one example of that is the wake-up call pattern. The wake-up call pattern brings the problem to light that is causing the need for change. So that's a good thing. But when you bring a problem to light, you can also make people angry if they're the reason the problem exists. So in all sections of every pattern, the negative consequences section makes the user of the pattern aware of the negative things that can happen, but also lists other patterns That's how a pattern language is created. So the negative consequences section lists other patterns the user can then use to fix the problems that the first pattern may have left behind. So everything is connected. So as Linda said, everything you do, you have to take time for reflection, which is another pattern, and find out what went well, what didn't go well, and then know what pattern to use next.
So how do I create the time to do all this?
I wish I knew how to answer that one. And I think that's part of what Evangelist and Know Yourself, which is a new pattern, are all about. That we realize up front when we're going to attempt a change effort that this is going to take an enormous amount of time. Even when we think it's going to take time, it's going to take a lot more time. And that it's going to be difficult, we're going to get discouraged, we're going to need a shoulder to cry on, which is one of our patterns. And realizing that up front makes you see that there's no silver bullet. You're going to have to create time. If you believe it's important enough, then you're going to have to find time. It's not going to magically appear. So that's why many change agents who start, as I did, just on their own, are going to realize after a while you're going to burn out if you're doing this on your own time. And you're going to make sure that you have close connections with your boss, your immediate manager, and maybe his boss and his boss, so that at some point they can say, we believe this is important enough that we're going to give you a little slice of your time here to work on this. If you never get that, you're probably not going to be successful.
And I will also add to that one of your goals in the beginning is to ask for help and develop a group identity around your idea. You do not have to do it all, nor should you do it all, nor can you do it all. So that will help also with the time issue.
Isn't it all about manipulating people at a more subtle level?
Yes. So one of the things I've gotten interested in since we started writing the patterns that I never had thought about before was an area in social psychology called influence. And once I began to look at all the research behind influence, I realized that most of these patterns work because they are based on influence strategies. So you can look at influence strategies as separate from the fearless change patterns, but when I teach a class in influence, I tie them directly to the fearless change patterns, and I say, now here's an example of a pattern that uses this particular influence strategy, and that the reason why it works, because we never look at that in our patterns. We don't look at the research. We have experience reports, known uses kinds of things. But we don't look at a lot of science, which I believe now is a mistake. But in the beginning, it would have been difficult. I wasn't even aware of the science. But it is. It is manipulation. It is influence. You are moving people in a direction they would not have gone if you hadn't been there to say, agile software development or these patterns or whatever it is. That's what you're trying to do. You're trying to convince people by using influence strategies, and that's not a bad thing. We should all be more aware of what those influence strategies are.
And also the goal, and we say this specifically in the book, is to help people become so interested and involved that they want to change. So we can't force anybody to change. So manipulation to me seems like a negative word. But influence, helping them understand the value in the idea and their part in the value and how it can help them and building an identity around it, is more like our goal, which is helping them become so involved and interested that they eventually choose to change.
So when the change turns out to be a bad idea, how do I not lose my face?
So that's what one of the patterns in the second book is evolving vision. And that ties into the time for reflection pattern, in that a leader of change and his or her team always has to be evaluating the end vision and whether it's still a good idea or it needs to be changed, right? So evolving vision recognizes that along the way, you and your team have to say, okay, this was our original idea. Is this still what we're aiming for or not? So you see, if you take that attitude, then you are just recognizing along the way that you didn't have all the answers in the beginning. Things are different than you thought, and you are stepping up and saying, okay, we need to take our original idea of what our original goal was and evolve it ever so slightly or ever large, in some large way. So that's what the evolving vision is about.
This ties in directly to the heart of agile development, which is embrace failure. That failure is how we learn. And in fact, I heard a talk here last night where the speaker began by saying, we learn best by failing. And that's true. There's research behind that. It does get our attention. So it's really hard to do that. But to realize that failure is there for a reason, I guess, that it gets our brain's attention, and what we should do is take advantage of that and learn from it. So embrace failure. It's about learning.
Each person has a different reality depending on her specific experience. Do the patterns take this into account?
That's exactly what cognitive neuroscience is all about, the realization that when you start, you have a great idea, to realize that that's just your perspective. And by using some of the patterns, like Involve Everyone, or trying to bring other evangelists in and using Fearless to listen to what they have to say, it means you have to be open to hearing other points of view, because no one, even people who are initially enthusiastic about the idea, no one's going to see it in exactly the same way you are. And that's a struggle in the beginning when you think, I have a vision, I know what I expect to happen, and to realize that, well, that may not be exactly what others, even your supporters, see as the end result or the goal for your new idea.
What is your experience in intercultural contexts? Do all patterns work equally well?
Well, we have a few patterns that we've recognized definitely are different in different cultures. One example is do food. So in the United States, people enjoy doing work over food, and food helps them do their work better and actually builds a community. And people that eat together feel closer together. But in other cultures, that's not really the case. So that's one example of every pattern has a cultural context. Now, there is no way that we could possibly have finished Fearless Change if we would consider every country's culture and every organizational's culture, because organizations have a culture too. So one of the things that helps with this is the context part of each pattern, and also the positive and negative consequences of each pattern. Also enlighten people on this, but most importantly, there's just too many cultures to say, well, possibly this, possibly that. You, the leader of change, and your team who's leading the change has to decide if that's a pattern that's good for you and good for the culture in your organization.
I think this is really important because I was just going back through one of Alexander's writings on culture, and he says that culture is a part of patterns, and there's no way to avoid that. So even if we look at exceptional cases like the Japanese example in Do Food, we're not going to cover them all. And so the patterns are biased. They're biased based on the people who sent us their experiences. And since we mostly did hear from Western Europe and the U.S., those patterns mostly apply in Western culture. So there are a lot of patterns where we run up against the idea that people are going to be more equal, or they're going to behave in certain ways that just don't apply in Asian cultures. And we should be open and honest about that.
I get that. But what's interesting is that our book was translated into Japanese because the Japanese culture wanted to have a copy of it. And it was also translated into Chinese because the Chinese cultures wanted to have a copy of it. And so I find that really interesting.
Usual patterns might have disadvantages described. So the person who is asking wonders that he's missing that in your description of the patterns. Probably the way you were talking about it, but maybe you want to say something about like negative consequences.
Well, I think, yeah, all patterns have, at the end of the pattern, they have what I remember an early pattern, my early pattern teacher told me, you know, the happy part of the pattern, you know, what are the wonderful things that happen as a result of using this, or the positive things. But you can't just look at that. Every action you take in the world has positive consequences and negative consequences, every action. So all patterns must recognize the negative consequences and then have patterns inside of that negative consequences section that help you how to deal with those negative consequences that could potentially occur. Don't always occur, but could potentially occur. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, and actually what a pattern is a state transition. So when you begin, you have a current context, and when you finish, you have a resulting context. And it's never going to be all wonderful. I don't care even if it's do food, that there are going to be penalties or downsides. And that is so hard for a pattern writer because you're writing the pattern because you like it or you believe in it. And now to have to suddenly say, well, but you know, it might not be great all the time if we continue to use this pattern. That is a very difficult section to write, and we don't always include every negative possibility because we just don't know what they are.
When I fail to make a change happen, does this mean I did something wrong, or are there simply change-resistant organizations? And I'm adding, or is there a third answer to it?
I don't understand the question. Do you understand?
Everyone resists change. We like to think that since we've written a set of patterns that, oh, well, of course, we know all about change, and that means we're open to it. We just bought 3 new laptops in my house, and we have been battling those laptops for the past month and a half. Why can't I do this? To be easy. So change is always going to have certain elements to it that are going to be struggles, and I don't know whether I'd call that a failure or not. I believe that if a sincere change agent has used a pattern like do food and doesn't get the result that he or she expects, that doesn't necessarily mean failure. In fact, I often wonder about Agile failure stories that I hear. And they say, well, this points to the fact that Agile doesn't work everywhere, Agile is not perfect, and it's a failure of Agile. I'm not sure. I didn't hear the story exactly. I wasn't there at the time, but I'm wondering if it's a combination of other things, and that to label the whole situation as a failure instead of saying, well, you know, there were a lot of things that worked well. We didn't get the result we hoped for, but maybe we should have been more open to other alternatives and to try to learn from that.
I agree.
Today it's all about testing. How many patterns are tested and validated to work as they are supposed to do?
That's a big problem, I think. We have never talked about this in the patterns community, and over the years I have become increasingly unhappy about the fact that we don't do real science with these and we don't test. We have known uses, and that means somebody else somewhere in a particular context used this pattern successfully. Does that mean that this pattern works in all contexts that are similar? No, it does not. So we're missing a testing phase. And we've never talked about it in the patterns community. I don't know of any discussion around, well, how would you do that? How would you validate the pattern? Would it take 3 more known uses? With no failures? Nobody talks about. Alexander doesn't talk about that. He does a better job of including research in his patterns, but nobody talks about validation or testing, and I believe that's definitely a problem. And if I had heard this question earlier, that person would have gotten the book.
And still, I look at it that these are not just ideas of things that may or may not work. Every single one of the patterns has known uses and more than one known use in different contexts. So the idea that we know that they're perfect and work in every single time, I don't know that you could ever write anything that you could say that about. But we have support for them, and we have people that continually give us feedback on them, and we continually improve them, and that at least is a step in the right direction.
How can a pattern-based change can be accomplished when management like to see a classic project plan for the change, like a change plan?
You can make the plan look like anything you want. This is a classic problem when you have an interface between two parts of an organization that think differently. And the interface should, if it's well done, take care of problems. So that interface needs to be created by people on either side who understand what each side wants. But given that, you can make that interface look like anything you want. If a high-level manager once reports every 6 months is looking for some kind of progress, you can do a pretty good job of meeting some of those demands. And in fact, you can probably do as good a job as was done in the past. We had the myth that because there was a linear plan and because there was a Gantt chart that we were going to meet milestones and that we were going to make progress. Well, not always. In fact, I would argue hardly ever. So I think using patterns is as good or maybe better than a lot of the linear approaches that we've used in the past.
And I remember one time working on a project where we estimated that it was going to be about a 2.5-year project, and the person above me wanted a specific plan, and so our team put together what we could and then constantly evaluated it, constantly reflected on it, and constantly evolved the plan. And so there was always something to see, but it made our team look good because we were always evaluating the plan and not necessarily being stuck to it.
Can you say something about, or some stories about, people successfully using or adopting the patterns?
Adopting patterns. Though I will say that since I just mentioned that 2.5-year project, during that 2.5-year project, I feel like that since I was the leader of the project and involved a big change in our organization, that I personally and the team would have just sunk without the use of the patterns. And I used each one of them often more than once, many of them more than once during the process. And so I can remember thinking many times along the way that I was really glad we had written the first book and we were in the process of writing the second one. And so that was my personal experience with them.
I think what's most surprising and gratifying is that over the years we hear stories all the time from people that we don't really know who want to tell us, usually it's about a particular pattern, but they're in the midst of a change obviously and they're using all of the patterns, but they want to call our attention to a particular one for some reason. And it's almost heartbreaking to hear some of the stories, because then you realize how popular the patterns are and how many people are using them successfully. And it would be nice to include all of those stories, because it's not validation, but it makes us feel better about having spent the time to write them.
And we also have some of the stories in our first book and our second book of people that have used them.
Now for something very specific. How do I know when the just do it pattern is sufficient?
I guess I would ask sufficient for what? Because just do it is definitely a starting pattern. So at each baby step, you have to be willing to just do that step, right? To just take the step and move forward. So it's not enough. It's just that's a pattern. It gets you moving, and then something else has to happen after that.
So the answer is it depends. There's an influence strategy called commitment and consistency, and the foundation of that is that just one small step is enough. That if you get somebody on the path, as it's called, by getting them to take one small step, then moving them along that path is trivial. So it depends on what kind of change it is, who the person that's making the change, but yeah, that is definitely possible. That's what good salespeople know how to do. Just get you to take one small step, and then you're going to buy that car or that computer or whatever you're trying to sell. That's all they do. That's all they need is just one. Sometimes it's just a signature sign this, and then it's done. Once and done.
Would you say that professionally working with change helps you to keep being young? I love that question, and that's my final question.
Mary Lynn. What keeps me young is somehow I've been very lucky. I've been lucky enough to be able to work with Mary Lynn. I've been lucky enough to somehow have the energy and the health to make it to all the conferences where I go. I think it's largely a matter of luck. I certainly didn't plan it. But once that happened, being around younger people, so there's research behind that. You are aging at the same rate as the people you hang out with. So never marry anybody who's older. You die sooner. The research is clear. So I'm lucky I get to hang out with younger people like Mary Lynn and Jutta and all of the wonderful people here, and that's what keeps me young.
And so I would say the fact that I'm very lucky to have worked with Linda for 20 years, and we are constantly talking and thinking and working, and so that keeps you young because it keeps your mind young. And to really, really enjoy the topic of change makes us always want to just keep working in this topic. So that keeps your brain young, which I'm not so sure it keeps your body young, but it definitely helps keep your brain young to keep thinking and enjoying something you really, really love to do.
Amen.
Thank you so much, Marilyn and Linda. Thank you.
Thank you, Jutta.